Good evening, my dear subscribers and night owls. Welcome back to the Sleepless Librarian, where stories come alive when the world is quiet. I'm so glad you've joined me tonight as we settle in for something truly special. Tonight, we're traveling back to the glittering, champagne-soaked world of the 1920s, to Long Island's West Egg, where mysterious millionaires throw lavish parties, where love and longing linger in the salty sea air, and where a single green light blinks hopefully across the bay. Before we begin, let's get comfortable. If you haven't already, find your coziest spot, maybe curl up under a blanket or sink into your favorite chair. Go ahead and dim your lights just a bit, so we can imagine we're gathered around Gatsby's grand fireplace as the last guests depart his party. This is a story about dreams and illusions, about love and loss, about the American dream in all its dazzling beauty and heartbreaking fragility. Over the next while, we'll walk the manicured lawns of East Egg, sneak into Gatsby's extravagant parties, and watch as destinies intertwine under the summer stars. So take a deep breath with me, in and out. Let the sounds of jazz music and clinking champagne glasses fade into your imagination. Unfurl that tension in your shoulders like one of Gatsby's unworn silk shirts. And when you're ready, we'll turn the first page together into this unforgettable world. The Great Gatsby, a restful retelling. The light across the water. The first whisper of summer brought me to West Egg, where the salt wind carried secrets across the bay. My cottage stood as a modest sentinel between two towering palaces, their windows glittering like watchful eyes after dark. To the left, Gatsby's mansion rose like a wedding cake left out in the rain, all marble curves and ivy-clad turrets where moths danced around wrought-iron lanterns. Every Friday, trucks groaned up the driveway bearing mountains of lemons and ice. By Sunday dawn, the servants would sweep up the remnants of revelry, pearl buttons torn from dresses, cigarette cases engraved with strangers' initials, single champagne flutes, bearing the ghostly imprint of lips that would never kiss here again. The air hung perpetually heavy with the scent of crushed gardenias and the faint metallic tang of the ocean, a perfume that clung to one's clothes like a lover's last embrace. I first noticed him at twilight on my third evening there, while the latest parties swirled through his ballroom, a kaleidoscope of sequins and swinging beads. The host himself stood motionless at the end of his dock. The setting sun painted his cream-colored suit in liquid gold as he stretched, his arms toward the darkening water, his fingers trembling slightly as if plucking invisible harp strings. Across the bay, a tiny green light blinked like a wayward star. "Your neighbor's a queer one," said the delivery boy who brought my groceries each morning. He nodded toward Gatsby's palace, where workmen were already dismantling last night's dance floor. "They say he killed a man in cold blood over in Europe." Others claim he's a German spy. My money's on him being some bankrupt duke hiding from creditors. The boy leaned in conspiratorially. Last month he paid a fellow $500 just to swim in his pool backward for an hour. The rumors multiplied with each passing week, that he kept a live tiger in his wine cellar, that all the books in his library were hollow, stuffed with cash instead of pages, that he'd once hosted a party where every guest arrived wearing a mask of his own face. Through it all, Gatsby remained an enigma, glimpsed occasionally at his balcony's edge, always watching that emerald beacon across the water. Then came the evening Jordan Baker dragged me into the current. "You must meet him properly," she murmured, her fingers cool as moonlight around my wrist. We floated through rooms where jazz musicians played atop grand pianos, past fountains spouting champagne instead of water, around couples entwined in shadowy alcoves. The air throbbed with stolen perfume and the sweat of strangers pressed too close. He appeared as if summoned, materializing beside me with 2 coops of bubbling gold. "Old sport," he said, pressing a glass into my hand. Up close, he was younger than I expected, his tanned skin pulled taut over sharp cheekbones, his hair the precise shade of wheat at harvest time. But his eyes betrayed him. They belonged to a much older man, one who'd stared too long at things that burned. We spoke of trivial things, the unseasonable heat, the new Broadway shows, yet his gaze kept drifting toward a particular archway where golden-haired women entered in clusters. When one laughed with a particular lilting cadence, his entire body tensed like a hound catching scent. As dawn painted the sky in watercolor hues, Jordan and I found ourselves alone by the emptied swimming pool. She lay back on a chaise lounge, her golf clubs glinting beside her like silver sentinels. "He's waiting for Daisy," she said without prompting. "Your cousin? They were madly in love before the war, before she married that oaf Tom." A swallow darted overhead, its wings slicing the pinkening air. "All this." She waved a hand at the wilting flowers and abandoned glasses. "It's all for her, every party, every pearl, every perfect rose, just bait to lure her across the bay." The revelation settled over me like fine dust. Suddenly the mansion made perfect sense, not a home, but a meticulously staged theatre. The endless flow of champagne to loosen tongues that might speak her name. The orchestra's relentless cheer to mask the silence of her absence. Even the green light I'd seen him reaching toward, a siren call to the past. That night, as I lay in bed with the windows open to the salt breeze, I heard the first notes of a solitary piano drifting from Gatsby's house. A mournful rendition of "Ain't We Got Fun" played just slightly too slow, as if the musician feared the song might end. "The Man in the Moonlit Garden." The piano's last trembling note hung in the dawn air like a question mark. Through my half-open window, I watched the silhouette in Gatsby's west tower finally rise from the bench, his outline dissolving into the dark interior as lamps were extinguished one by one. The mansion exhaled, settling into its daytime sleep just as the first fishing boats puttered across the bay, their diesel engines coughing against the tide. 3 days later, an invitation arrived on paper so thick it felt like woven silk. Gatsby's signature looped extravagantly beneath the words, "You are cordially requested," in ink that shimmered faintly emerald when tilted toward the light. That evening I found myself following a path of crushed opalescent shells to where my host stood beneath a weeping cherry tree, its blossoms glowing like pale pink lanterns in the twilight. "Old sport," he called, raising a glass of something that caught the sunset in its amber depths. Up close, I noticed new details. The faint scar along his jawline shaped like a crescent moon, the way his cufflinks bore an intricate design of entwined daisies, how his shoes reflected the fireflies winking in the hedges. He moved with the careful grace of a man who'd practiced every gesture in front of mirrors. The party unfolded like a dream where familiar faces melted into strangers between blinks. A woman in a feathered headdress wept softly into the champagne fountain. A pair of identical twins in matching silver gowns played chess, using shrimp cocktails as pawns. And through it all, Gatsby wove his golden thread, touching elbows here, whispering there, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd like a lighthouse beam sweeping dark waters. Near midnight, I discovered Jordan Baker lounging in a hidden alcove behind a tapestry of hunting hounds. She held a martini in one hand and a lobster claw in the other, looking thoroughly pleased with herself. "He wants you to invite Daisy to tea," she said without preamble. Her smile was a cat's before the pounce. "He's terrified to approach her directly after all these years. Needs you as... what's the word? Bait." The story spilled out between sips of gin, how 5 summers ago a penniless officer named J. Gatsby had fallen desperately for 18-year-old Daisy Fay of Louisville, how they'd loved fiercely beneath the southern magnolias until the war tore them apart, how she'd married brutish Tom Buchanan while Gatsby was overseas, his letters returning unopened. "And now?" I asked, watching our host across the room, where he stood pretending to examine a vase of peonies. Jordan's grin turned sharp. "Now he's built this..." She waved her lobster claw at the crystal chandeliers. "All to stand across the bay from her dock light. Rather tragic, isn't it? Like one of those night tales where the fellow builds a castle to impress a princess who's already married the ogre." The clock struck 2 when I finally escaped into the garden's maze of topiaries. Fireflies pulsed in the rose bushes like tiny arrhythmic hearts. There, beneath an arbor dripping with wisteria, I came upon Gatsby alone with a photograph clutched in trembling hands. Even in the moonlight I recognized Daisy's face, her smile slightly blurred from the image being handled too often. He didn't startle when I approached. "She has the most extraordinary voice," he murmured, tracing the photograph's edge with a reverent finger. "It's full of..." His free hand made a strange, fluttering motion near his chest. "Money," he finished, though his eyes said something else entirely. We stood in silence as the party's remnants staggered past the hedge, their laughter muffled by the thick foliage. Somewhere, a glass shattered on marble. A woman sang off-key in French. The scents of spilled perfume and cigar smoke drifted through the garden like ghosts of revelries past. At last, Gatsby tucked the photograph into his breast pocket, precisely where a heart would beat. "You'll do it then? The tea?" His voice held the fragile hope of a child asking if summer would last forever. When I nodded, his entire being seemed to brighten from within, as if someone had turned up his internal lamps. "Splendid, old sport. Simply splendid." He clasped my shoulder, his palm oddly cool despite the humid night. "I'll have the place filled with flowers. Her favourites are white orchids, you know, and the cakes must be those little pink ones from that shop on Fifth Avenue." And a burst of raucous laughter from the terrace cut him off. The moment shattered. Gatsby's hand fell away as his public mask slid back into place. The charming host, the mysterious millionaire, the man who threw parties but never attended them. "Until Thursday," he said over his shoulder, as he moved toward the noise, already straightening his tie. The wisteria blossoms trembled in his wake, releasing a shower of petals that clung to his shoulders like pale purple snowflakes as he disappeared into the house. I lingered in the garden as dawn's first fingers crept across the sky. The last guests had departed hours ago, leaving behind a trail of forgotten gloves and cigarette cases. Inside, servants moved like silent shadows, sweeping up the remnants of another perfect party. Through an upstairs window I glimpsed Gatsby standing before a mirror, carefully practicing his smile, adjusting its width, its warmth, its wattage. As one might rehearse lines, for the most important performance of a lifetime. The Orchid Hour. The morning of Daisy's arrival dawned with the sky the color of wet newspaper. Rain fell in soft, persistent sheets, turning Gatsby's driveway into a mirror that reflected the grey clouds as I splashed toward my cottage. Inside, a transformation had taken place overnight. Every surface groaned under the weight of white orchids, their waxy petals trembling whenever the door moved. The air hung thick with their cloying perfume, like walking into the heart of a funeral bouquet. Gatsby arrived hours early, pacing my sitting room with the restless energy of a caged leopard. His usually impeccable suit showed wrinkles at the elbows, and I noticed for the first time how his hair wasn't truly blonde, but the pale gold of good bourbon held up to sunlight. Every few minutes he'd check his pocket watch, then the window, then adjust the angle of a flower vase by millimeters. "Does it look—" He gestured helplessly at the orchid-laden room, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I mean to say, is it enough?" Before I could answer, a car splashed to a stop outside. Through the rain-streaked window, I watched Daisy emerge like a phantom in white, her small frame nearly swallowed by an enormous fur collar that dripped diamonds of water. Gatsby froze mid-step, his face draining of color until the scar on his jaw stood out like a chalk mark. And something remarkable happened. As Daisy's gloved hand touched my gate, the downpour slackened to a mist. Sunlight broke through the clouds in hesitant fingers, setting the raindrops on Gatsby's hedges ablaze. It was as if the weather itself held its breath for this moment they'd both rehearsed in their private dreams for 5 endless years. The doorbell rang. Gatsby had vanished. One moment vibrating with anticipation by the fireplace, the next simply gone, leaving only a damp footprint on the hardwood. I opened the door to find Daisy blinking up at me, her famous eyes wide and liquid as a doe's. "Why, Nick, darling," she breathed, her voice that magical trick of sounding both delighted and disappointed at once. "However did you find this quaint little—" "Oh." Her gasp came as Gatsby materialized in the hallway behind me, water dripping from his hair onto the parquet floor. For one suspended heartbeat, the three of us formed a perfect tableau. Daisy, with one foot, still on the porch. Me, half-turned in the doorway. Gatsby looking as if he'd been struck by lightning. Then time snapped back into motion. "Jay!" Daisy's voice was barely audible over the dripping eaves. The name slipped out like a secret she'd been holding between her teeth for years. What followed was both beautiful and excruciating to witness. Gatsby became a magician, producing wonders from thin air. The special tea blend from London, the exact petit four she'd loved at 18, a particular song on the gramophone that made Daisy's hands fly to her mouth. "Oh!" she cried when the melody began, her eyes darting between us. "They played this at my debut. However did you remember?" Gatsby's answering smile held all the fragile triumph of a man who's finally reached land after years adrift. "I remember everything," he murmured, his fingers tracing the edge of her teacup without quite touching it. When the rain slowed to a mist, we crossed to his mansion through gardens where every blossom seemed to have bloomed overnight in anticipation. The usual army of servants had been dismissed. Our footsteps echoed through cavernous rooms, normally teeming with life. In the ballroom, Gatsby spun Daisy gently across the polished floor, their reflections shimmering in the mirrored walls like ghosts of their younger selves. "You see?" He gestured to the grandeur surrounding them.
I built it all for this, for you to fill it.
Daisy's laughter bounced off the crystal chandeliers as she drifted from room to room, trailing her fingers over gilded surfaces. But in the unguarded moments when she thought no one was looking, her face took on a strange, almost frightened expression, like someone who'd stepped into a dream only to find it more real than waking life. The tour ended in Gatsby's bedroom, where he opened a carved walnut cabinet with trembling hands. Inside lay stacks of newspapers tied with silk ribbons, every Louisville Courier Journal from April 1917 onward. "You see," he whispered, touching the yellowed edges with reverence. "I never forgot a single day." Daisy made a small wounded sound and reached for him, their fingers tangled in the space between their bodies, and I turned away, suddenly certain I was witnessing something too private for any audience. Later, as twilight painted the windows in watercolor hues, I found them sitting knee to knee on Gatsby's sunroom settee. Daisy was crying in that beautiful way of hers, no reddened nose or blotchy skin, just perfect tears rolling down perfect cheeks as she clutched one of his monogrammed shirts to her chest.
"I've never seen such beautiful shirts before," she sobbed, the fabric muffling her words. Whether she wept for the luxury or the years lost between them, I couldn't tell. Only that the sound was the same soft hiccup a child makes when waking from a wonderful dream to find it gone.
Outside, the last raindrops fell from the gutters like a slow dripping clock, counting down the hours they had left, the cracks in the gold. The morning after Daisy's visit dawned unnaturally still, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the fading perfume of orchids. I found Gatsby at his sunroom window, staring at the imprint Daisy's shoes had left on his terrace stones, 2 crescent moons of damp that were slowly evaporating in the new light. His fingers traced the edge of a coffee cup bearing the ghostly pink stain of her lipstick, his face caught somewhere between wonder and terror. "She'll return this afternoon," he murmured, though I hadn't asked. "I've arranged for a pianist, the same fellow who played at her debut." His eyes flicked to the grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging like a metronome, counting down to some invisible crescendo. Across the bay, the Buchanan household stirred to life. Through my binoculars, I watched Tom emerge onto his porch, his massive frame blocking the sunlight as he stretched and scratched his stomach. Behind him, Daisy floated past windows in a pale dressing gown, her movements oddly jerky compared to yesterday's liquid grace. When Tom called something over his shoulder, she froze mid-step like a startled fawn before forcing a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. The contrast between the two houses became a living thing that week. Gatsby's mansion thrummed with manic energy, fresh flowers arriving hourly, new treasures appearing to delight Daisy, a music box from Paris, a pearl-handled hairbrush said to have belonged to Marie Antoinette. Meanwhile, East Egg simmered with quiet tension. Tom's voice grew louder at parties, his hands heavier on Daisy's waist when they danced. It was at one such party that the Fishers began to show. The Buchanans had gathered their usual set, the sleek, bored faces of old money sipping cocktails and trading veiled insults. Jordan and I watched from the periphery as Daisy performed her role as hostess, her famous laugh ringing just a half-beat too shrill.
"Notice anything peculiar?" Jordan murmured, her golf club tapping a silent rhythm against her thigh.
At first, I saw nothing. Then as Daisy turned to accept a fresh drink, The sleeve of her chiffon dress slipped back to reveal a bruise flowering around her wrist, the exact size and shape of Tom's fingers. My gaze flew to where he stood across the terrace, his thick neck reddening as he glared at a newspaper someone had left open on the table. The headline read, "Mystery Millionaire Funds Orphanage." Below it, a grainy photo of Gatsby at some charity gala. Tom's reaction was instantaneous. He snatched up the paper, his lips moving silently as he scanned the article. Then his head snapped up, eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto Daisy with frightening intensity. She went very still, her glass pausing halfway to her lips, as if she could feel the weight of his stare, like physical pressure. The ride home that night was suffocating. Tom drove with one hand clenched on the wheel, the other possessively covering Daisy's knee. When we passed Gatsby's house, its windows blazing with light, the faint strains of a waltz floating across the water, I saw Daisy's fingers tighten around her clutch purse until the beads popped off one by one, scattering across the car floor like tiny fallen stars. 3 days later, the heat wave broke with a violence that seemed ripped from a Greek tragedy. The air hung thick as wet wool as our ill-fated group gathered at the Buchanan's for what would become our last civilized meal together. Daisy floated between the dining room and terrace in a white dress that made her look like a melting candle, while Tom drank steadily, his eyes growing darker with each glass. Gatsby, resplendent in cream linen, watched Daisy with the focused intensity of a man reading his own execution notice. Every time she laughed at one of Tom's jokes, his fingers tightened around his fork until the silver bent. It was when Daisy reached across Tom to refill his wineglass, her sleeve brushing his shoulder with practiced wifely intimacy, that Gatsby finally broke. "Let's all go to town," he blurted, his voice too loud in the stagnant air. "It's unbearable here. We'll take rooms at the plaza, iced drinks, cool baths." His eyes begged Daisy to understand the unspoken plea. "Somewhere he can't touch you." The drive into Manhattan passed in a blur of heat and tension. Gatsby's yellow rolls purred ahead of us, Daisy's white scarf fluttering from the window like a surrender flag. Tom drove his coupe with grim determination, his knuckles white on the wheel. Beside me, Jordan hummed a tuneless melody, her eyes half-lidded against the glare. Then came the Valley of Ashes. Even in the sweltering afternoon, the place retained its grey pallor, the dead land stretching out like a warning between West Egg and the city. As we passed Wilson's garage, I caught a glimpse of Myrtle at the upstairs window, her face pressed to the glass as Tom's car approached. Her eyes widened when she saw our procession, her mouth forming an O of surprise before we sped past. The plaza suite was an icebox compared to the outdoor furnace. Ceiling fans stirred the heavy air as we arranged ourselves with terrible politeness. Daisy perched on a settee between the two men, Jordan and I hovering near the liquor cart like reluctant referees. For one suspended moment, everything balanced on a knife's edge. Then Tom shattered the illusion. "So, Gatsby," he drawled, swirling his drink, "exactly which Oxford college did you attend again?" The room went very still. Gatsby's smile didn't waver, but his fingers tightened around his highball glass until I feared it might shatter. "I told you, old sport, I studied at—" "Because the fellows at the club made some inquiries." Tom's voice dripped faux concern. "Strange thing, no record of any J. Gatsby matriculating there in 1919, or any year for that matter." Daisy made a small noise like a wounded bird. Gatsby's eyes flew to her face, his carefully constructed mask beginning to crack at the edges. The demolition continued with methodical cruelty, the shady business dealings, the bootlegging rumors, the questionable associates. With each revelation, Daisy seemed to shrink inside her white dress, her eyes darting between the two men like a rabbit deciding which direction to bolt. When Gatsby turned to her, his voice held the raw desperation of a man clinging to a cliff's edge. "Daisy, tell him? Tell him you never loved him." The silence that followed was the most terrible sound I'd ever heard.
I can't say I never loved Tom," she whispered at last.
Something in Gatsby's eyes went dark then, like a lighthouse beam suddenly extinguished. Tom made a sound of triumph and reached for Daisy's wrist, his fingers encircling the fading bruise with possessive satisfaction. The drive home began in suffocating silence. Then, as we passed through the Valley of Ashes once more, the world exploded into nightmare. A figure darted from Wilson's garage, Myrtle, in her cheap finery, her arms outstretched toward what she thought was Tom's car. The impact was less a sound than a feeling, a sickening thud that reverberated through the yellow Rolls frame. In the rearview mirror, I saw her body tumble like a broken doll, her dark hair fanning across the pavement, the beads of her necklace scattering like tiny stars. Gatsby's car never stopped. Only when Tom's coupe pulled up behind us at the gas station did we learn the truth. "That was Myrtle," he said, his face ashen. The mechanic's wife, his mistress, the woman whose blood now streaked the yellow paint of Gatsby's car. That night, I found Gatsby standing in the reeds by the Buchanan's dock, his shirt translucent with dew, staring up at the dark windows where Daisy slept, or pretended to sleep. "She'll call tomorrow," he said when he saw me. His voice had the quiet certainty of a man reciting scripture. "When things have settled, she loves me." Above us, the green light blinked once, then disappeared behind rolling fog. The ashes of desire. Dawn came reluctantly to West Egg, the sun bleeding through layers of low-hanging mist as I stood watching Gatsby's vigil from the reeds. His shirt clung to his shoulders in damp patches where the night's dew had settled, and his hair, usually so meticulously arranged, curled in dishevelled strands at his temples. The first rays of sunlight caught the gold in his signet ring as he checked his watch for the 100th time, the tiny click of the mechanism unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Across the bay, the Buchanan house slept behind drawn curtains. Not a single lamp had flickered to life all night, though twice I'd seen shadows move behind the upstairs windows, quick, furtive shifts like prey animals sensing a predator. The green light at the end of their dock had been inexplicably extinguished, its usual pulse conspicuously absent from the morning tableau. Gatsby didn't seem to notice. His eyes remained fixed on Daisy's bedroom window, his lips moving occasionally as if rehearsing speeches only she would hear. When a maid finally appeared to draw back the curtains at 7:30, he startled like a gunshot had sounded, his entire body tensing as if preparing to sprint forward. But no golden head appeared at the glass, only the maid's indifferent profile as she shook out a dust cloth. The walk back to his mansion was a study in slow collapse. Gatsby's normally perfect posture sagged with each step, his shoes leaving dark prints on the sun-warmed pavement. At his front door, he paused to straighten his tie with trembling fingers before entering, The performance must continue, even for an audience of none. Inside, the aftermath of yesterday's disaster lay untouched. A half-drunk glass of gin fizz still sweated on the piano, its bubbles long gone flat. On the side table, a plate of tea cakes had hardened into sad little monuments. The entire house smelled like dying flowers, and the faint metallic tang of the pool filter struggling against neglected maintenance. I found Gatsby standing before the cabinet where he kept his Louisville newspapers, his fingers trailing over the carefully preserved stacks. "She'll call after breakfast," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "When he's gone to the club." His reflection in the glass showed a face aging by the minute, the lines around his eyes deepening as if drawn by an invisible hand. The telephone did ring that morning, but it was only a drunken reveller from 2 nights prior inquiring about a lost pearl earring. Each shrill burst of the bell sent Gatsby lunging across the room, only to slump further when the caller proved to be someone else. By noon, he'd taken to pacing between the phone and the window overlooking the bay, his movements growing increasingly erratic, straightening already perfect cushions, rearranging the liquor bottles by height, wiping non-existent dust from the mantel clock. At 3:15, the doorbell rang instead. Gatsby froze mid-step, his face lighting with desperate hope, until his butler announced Inspector Klein from the Queensborough Police Department. The interview lasted less than 20 minutes, but left Gatsby visibly shaken. Through the cracked study door, I caught snippets. Hit and run, Valley of Ashes, yellow car. When the inspector left, he carried with him a thick envelope that hadn't been in his hands upon arrival. Gatsby watched the police car disappear down the drive, his expression unreadable. "She's protecting me," he said suddenly, turning to me with eyes that burned too bright. "That's why she hasn't called. She knows they'll be watching her." His fingers plucked at his ruined cufflinks, the daisy-patterned ones he'd worn specially for Daisy's visits. "I'll send word through Jordan. Yes, that's best." But Jordan, when I reached her by telephone, sounded uncharacteristically subdued. "They've closed up the house," she said, her voice oddly muffled. "Tom's taking Daisy to Lake Placid. They left this morning." A pause. "She asked me not to tell you." I relayed none of this to Gatsby, who by nightfall had convinced himself Daisy would come under cover of darkness. He ordered all the mansion's lights extinguished save for a single lamp by the front door. "So she'll know I'm waiting," he explained, his pupils dilated in the gloom. Midnight found us at opposite ends of his deserted ballroom, the empty floor between us strewn with forgotten party favors and crushed cigarette ends. Moonlight streamed through the French windows, painting Gatsby in silver and shadow as he stood perfectly still at the piano, one finger resting on a yellowed key. "She once told me—" His voice cracked like thin ice. "She said my house felt like magic, like anything could happen here." His hand fell away from the piano, the unanswered note hanging between us. Somewhere in the distance, a motorboat coughed to life on the sound. Gatsby's head snapped up at the sound, his entire body tensing, but the puttering engine faded eastward toward the open ocean. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 4 hollow notes before grinding to a stop, its gears exhausted. Gatsby didn't seem to notice. He'd taken up his vigil at the window again, his forehead pressed to the glass as the first grey light of morning crept across the lawn. Out in the bay, the Buchanan's docklight remained stubbornly dark. "The last swim," The fifth morning dawned hotter than the four before it, the air thick enough to chew as I crossed the lawn to Gatsby's mansion. The usual army of gardeners had vanished, leaving the hydrangeas to wilt in their beds, their petals browning at the edges like old love letters. Through the open French windows I spotted Gatsby, already dressed in his white flannels despite the hour, standing motionless before the empty fireplace where a single pink tea cake sat fossilizing on a silver tray. He turned when my shadow fell across the threshold, and I barely suppressed a gasp. The man who had hosted hundreds in this very room now looked like a photograph left too long in the sun, his golden pallor gone sallow, his crisp linen suit hanging loose where he'd dropped at least 10 pounds. Only his eyes remained painfully alive, burning with a feverish intensity as they darted to the silent telephone. "You're just in time, old sport." His voice rasped like sandpaper. "I've decided to take a swim." The pool area lay abandoned, its usual attendants nowhere to be seen. Gatsby moved like a sleepwalker across the flagstones, trailing his fingers along the diving board where Daisy had laughed herself breathless just weeks before. The water sparkled unnaturally blue in the harsh sunlight, the filter having run continuously despite the house's growing neglect. Always hated the damn thing until she came. He knelt to adjust the temperature valve with trembling hands. Had it heated to 80 degrees, the exact temperature of that hotel pool in Louisville where we... His words dissolved into a coughing fit that left him gripping the ladder for balance. I watched helplessly as he shed his robe to reveal a body already halfway to vanishing, ribs pressing against tanned skin, the hollows above his collarbones deep enough to hold shadows. The once glorious tan had faded to a sickly parchment tone, making the scar on his jaw stand out like a misplaced punctuation mark. The water accepted him without a splash. For a long moment, Gatsby simply floated on his back, his arms outstretched toward the cloudless sky as if measuring some invisible distance. The morning light turned his hair translucent, where it fanned around his head like a drowning man's crown. "I had a letter from Wolfsheim," he said suddenly, his voice echoing off the pool tiles. "He suggests I winter in Europe, says I've grown..." His fingers plucked at the water's surface. "Recalcitrant." A pause. "I think he means predictable." A dragonfly buzzed between us, its iridescent wings catching the light as it hovered near Gatsby's shoulder. He watched it with the quiet fascination of a man who'd forgotten how ordinary miracles worked. "Did you know they're born under water?" he murmured. "Live for years down there before climbing up some reed to split open and become..." His hand rose, dripping to indicate the shimmering creature. This. The metaphor hung between us, fragile and transparent. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed noon, or tried to, the mechanism choking on the 7th note. Gatsby's head turned toward the sound, his neck tendons standing out like rigging on a listing ship. Then the phone rang. The effect was electric. Gatsby's entire body spasmed, sending waves sloshing over the pool's edge as he scrambled for the ladder. Water sheeted off him as he ran barefoot across the scorching stones, leaving wet footprints that evaporated almost instantly in the brutal heat. I followed at a distance, arriving in the study just in time to see his shoulders slump. "Yes, I understand," he was saying to the receiver, his voice carefully modulated despite the obvious disappointment. "No, that won't be necessary. Thank you for calling, Inspector." The click of the phone settling into its cradle sounded unnaturally final. Gatsby stood perfectly still for a count of 10, then turned with a smile so forced it looked painful. "Police business," he said, brushing non-existent lint from his damp chest. "All settled now." His hands trembled as he poured 2 fingers of gin from the decanter, the liquid sloshing over the rim as he raised it in a mock toast. "To swimming against the tide, old sport." The afternoon stretched thin as cellophane. We drifted through the empty mansion like ghosts haunting our own lives, Gatsby pausing occasionally to straighten a picture frame or run a finger along the piano keys without pressing hard enough to sound a note. At one point, he disappeared upstairs and returned wearing a fresh suit, but the same hollow expression. As shadows lengthened across the lawn, a strange calm settled over him. He ordered the pool lights lit despite the lingering daylight, then methodically arranged a stack of towels on the lounger, as if expecting company. When the telephone rang again at dusk, he didn't flinch, just continued smoothing the already perfect towels with meticulous care. I answered to find Wilson on the line, his voice rasping with grief and something darker. "I know about the car," he said, each word dripping with terrible certainty. "The Yellow Death car." Before I could respond, the line went dead. Gatsby barely reacted when I relayed the message. "Poor bastard," he murmured, adjusting the angle of a potted orchid. "Might have been me in another life." His fingers lingered on a waxy petal. "Probably will be." The first stars were pricking through the violet sky when he finally returned to the pool, shedding his jacket with the ceremony of a man preparing for baptism. The underwater lights turned the water an unnatural aquamarine, casting rippling reflections across his face as he waded in up to his waist. "Remember what I said about dragonflies, old sport?" His voice echoed slightly in the still air. "Sometimes I wonder if we're all just—" a vague gesture toward the darkening horizon. "Waiting for our turn to climb out of the muck and become something beautiful." He leaned back into the water then, arms outstretched as if to embrace the sky. The pool lights made his skin glow faintly blue, his hair fanning out like tendrils of seaweed as he floated motionless, staring up at the first bold stars. I left him there, trusting the night to keep its vigil. The last I saw, he was still floating, a pale comma against the dark water, one hand trailing as if to catch the moon's reflection. Somewhere across the bay, the Buchanan house stood dark and silent. No green light pulsed in the gathering dark. No phone rang with last-minute reprieves. Only the cicadas sang on, their rhythmic thrumming the perfect soundtrack for a dream's slow dissolution. The empty house. The gunshot cracked through the pre-dawn stillness like a branch snapping underfoot. I woke tangled in sweat-damp sheets, momentarily convinced I'd dreamed the sound, until the second shot came, its echo rolling across the water with terrible finality. Bare feet slapping cold marble, I raced through Gatsby's mansion where dust motes swirled in the first blue light. The French doors to the pool stood wide open, curtains billowing like ghosts trying to escape. Outside, the underwater lights still glowed, turning the water an unearthly turquoise where 2 bodies floated in macabre ballet. Gatsby lay on his back near the center, arms outstretched as if frozen mid-swim. The water around him bloomed crimson from a wound just below his right collarbone, tendrils of blood unfurling like delicate roots in the disturbed water. 30 feet away, face down in the petunias, George Wilson sprawled with the revolver still clutched in his stiffening hand, the same pistol that had ended Myrtle's life now having completed its terrible circuit. For one suspended moment, the world held its breath. Then the screaming started, a maid in the upstairs window, her wails shattering the illusion that death could be beautiful. The aftermath unfolded with nightmarish clarity. Police swarmed the property, their black boots leaving muddy prints on the pristine terrace. Reporters clustered at the gates, flashbulbs popping like distant lightning. The medical examiner's men lifted Gatsby's body from the pool with a wet sucking sound, his skin already taking on the waxy pallor of abandoned candles. I stood numbly by as they zipped him into a black bag that shone faintly with pool water. One of the detectives pressed a soggy envelope into my hands. Inside, the last letter from Wolfsheim, its ink blurred beyond reading. "Found it by the telephone," the man muttered. "Thought you should have it." The sun rose higher, baking the bloodstains into the flagstones. By noon, the yellow rolls had been impounded, the pool drained, the mansion sealed. I wandered through rooms that already felt haunted, my fingers trailing over the artifacts of Gatsby's unfinished life. A half-smoked cigar in the ashtray, a monogrammed handkerchief draped over a chairback, the photograph of Daisy still tucked in his bedroom drawer where the police had missed it. That afternoon the phone rang for the first time in days. I lunged for it like Gatsby would have, only to hear Jordan's voice, tight with forced casualness. "They're saying it was an accident," she lied smoothly. "That Wilson didn't realize—" A pause filled with all the things we wouldn't say. Tom and Daisy left for Europe this morning. Sailed before dawn. The funeral was scheduled for 2 days hence, a formality no one expected to attend. Wolfsheim sent regrets by telegram. Business prevents. The Buchanan's silence was its own answer. Even the party guests who'd caroused through these halls seemed to have vanished into the summer haze. On the eve of the service, Henry Gatz arrived from Minnesota, carrying a cheap valise and the bewildered pride of a father who'd never stopped believing in his son's rewritten story. He moved through the mansion, touching things with reverent fingers, the crystal decanters, the leather-bound books, the framed photograph of Gatsby at Oxford that I knew to be doctored. "Jimmy was always ambitious," the old man kept repeating, as if this explained the marble staircases and imported shirts. He showed me the childhood ledger, where young James Gatz had outlined his path to greatness, every hour accounted for, every self-improvement task checked off with military precision. The final entry read simply, "Be worthy of her." Rain fell on the morning we buried him, turning the cemetery into a sea of black umbrellas and mud. Besides Henry and myself, only 3 souls attended: the owl-eyed man from the library, a reporter taking notes for tomorrow's scandal sheets, and a lone woman in a heavy veil who disappeared before I could speak to her. As the casket lowered into the earth, Henry pressed something into my hand, Gatsby's cufflinks, the daisy-patterned ones he'd worn for Daisy. "He'd want you to have them," the old man whispered, though his eyes said he didn't understand why. I returned to the mansion one last time as twilight painted the windows orange. Workmen were already dismantling the orchestra platform, their hammers sounding like distant gunshots. In the drained pool, a single dead dragonfly floated in the shallow puddle at the deep end, its iridescent wings stuck fast to the tiles. Upstairs in Gatsby's bedroom, I found his father kneeling by the bed, carefully folding each silk shirt as if preparing his son for another journey. The ledger lay open beside him, its pages fluttering slightly in the breeze from an open window. Outside, the first stars appeared, cold and bright and impossibly distant, the ledger of broken dreams. The morning after the funeral, the air in Gatsby's mansion smelled of lemon oil and unshed tears. Sunlight streamed through the east-facing windows, illuminating dust motes that swirled like tiny ghosts above the packing crates. Henry Gats had left at dawn, clutching his son's childhood ledger and a bundle of monogrammed handkerchiefs, his shoulders bowed under a grief too large for words. Now only the servants and I remained to dismantle the dream piece by piece. I started in the study, where Gatsby's desk held the quiet tragedy of unfinished business. Unopened letters fanned across the leather blotter, invitations to parties that would never be thrown, stock reports for investments that no longer mattered, a bill from the florist for the orchids that had welcomed Daisy. Beneath them all, hidden in a drawer with a broken latch, I found the newspaper clippings, dozens of them, carefully trimmed and dated. Daisy's society wedding announcement, Miss Fay weds football star. A gossip column noting her presence at the Belmont Stakes. Even mundane mentions of her charity work, each underlined in faint pencil, where Gatsby's fingers had traced her name. The most recent, dated just 2 weeks prior, showed her laughing at one of Tom's polo matches, her white dress a blur of motion. On the margin, in handwriting, grown shaky. Does she still love the sound of fireworks? The library yielded its own secrets. Though Gatsby had boasted that all his books were real, I discovered one hollow volume, a fake Great Expectations, with its pages carefully carved out to form a hiding place. Inside lay a dried gardenia, brittle as parchment, and a dance card from a 1917 country club ball in Louisville. Daisy's looping script filled every line, each dance promised to J.G., Upstairs in the bedroom, the wardrobe still held the faint scent of his cologne, bergamot and something indefinably warm, like sunshine on good wool. As I emptied the drawers, a small box tumbled from a stack of silk pajamas, scattering its contents across the carpet. Buttons, dozens of them in every conceivable size and color. I knelt to collect them, my fingers stumbling over pearl and horn and mother of pearl, until I realized each came from Daisy's visits. A jet button from her navy day dress, a tiny mother-of-pearl disc that must have fastened her lingerie. Even the ornate clasp from the fur collar she'd worn that first rainy afternoon. The bathroom medicine cabinet held more intimate relics, a toothbrush still damp from his last use, a razor with a single golden hair caught in its teeth, a nearly empty bottle of hair tonic labelled in French. The mirror above the sink retained the ghostly outline of his handprints, where he'd leaned close each morning to practice his smile, the careful curve he'd perfected for Daisy's benefit. By midday I retreated to the sunroom where the orchids had first trembled in Daisy's presence. Now only empty pots remained, their soil dry and cracked. From this vantage point the bay stretched calm and blue, its surface broken only by the occasional sailboat. The Buchanan mansion stood silent across the water, its windows dark, its dock empty of everything save the pole where the green light had burned. A cough at the doorway startled me. The butler, his usually impeccable uniform, rumpled from packing. "Found these in the garage, sir." He extended a box of automobile brochures, each featuring the latest yellow Rolls-Royce models. Beneath them lay a child's drawing on butcher paper, a crude sketch of a car labelled "My Auto When Rich" in wobbly block letters. As afternoon shadows lengthened, I climbed to the tower room where Gatsby had kept his vigil. The space was smaller than I'd imagined, barely large enough for the single chair positioned before the window. On the sill rested a pair of binoculars, their lenses still trained on Daisy's bedroom window across the bay. A coffee cup nearby held dregs gone mouldy, its rim stained with the faint pink imprint of Gatsby's lips. Here, in this cramped eyrie, the full pathos of his longing became unbearable. The scuff marks on the floorboards showed how often he'd paced. The indentations in the chair arms betrayed his nervous grip. Even the window glass bore the faint smudges of his fingertips where he'd pressed against the pane, as if mere looking could bridge the distance between dream and reality. Dusk found me in the kitchen, watching the cook wrap Gatsby's china in newspaper. "Never seen a man care so much about cakes," she murmured, folding newsprint around a serving platter. "Had me make fresh batches every morning just in case." Her hands stilled on a tiered stand. "Most went straight to the trash." That night I slept in Gatsby's bed, not out of morbid curiosity, but because the servants had already stripped the guest rooms. His pillows smelled faintly of hair tonic and the sea. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the French doors in their frames. Somewhere in the mansion, a loose shutter banged with metronomic regularity, like the pendulum of a clock counting down the hours until memory faded. Just before dawn, I dreamed of him standing at the end of his dock, his arms outstretched not toward the green light, but to the empty space where it had been. When I woke, the sheets were damp with sweat or seawater. I couldn't tell which. The first pale light revealed a single dried orchid petal stuck to the pillowcase, its edges curled like a dead man's fingers. The last party, the final morning in Gatsby's mansion, dawned with unnatural clarity, the light falling in sharp angles through curtainless windows where dust danced in the stillness. I walked barefoot across floors that echoed hollow underfoot, my footsteps the only sound in a house that had once pulsed with music and laughter. The movers had done their work too well. Each room stood stripped not just of furniture, but of the very essence that had made it Gatsby's. Only ghosts remained, the faint outline where a Degas print had hung above the mantel, the lighter patch of wallpaper where his favourite clock had ticked away the hours, the scuff marks on the parquet where hundreds of dancing feet had shuffled and spun. In the kitchen, a single coffee cup waited on the counter, the last piece of china not yet packed. As I drank, my eyes fell on the chalkboard where the cook had scribbled menus for parties that would never happen. July 3rd, oysters, Rockefeller, filet mignon, peach, Melba, no strawberries, Mrs. B allergic. Someone had drawn a careful daisy beside the note, its petals slightly lopsided. The pool area lay abandoned under the brutal noon sun, its drained basin showing cracks in the plaster that had been invisible beneath the water's shimmering veil. A dead dragonfly clung to the filter grate, its wings folded like tiny sails on a ship that would never sail again. I sat on the edge where Gatsby had last floated, my fingers tracing the cold tiles, still faintly stained pink from the chemicals that had failed to cleanse his blood. Upstairs in the tower room, the binoculars still pointed toward East Egg, their lenses gathering dust instead of dreams. I lifted them for one final look. Daisy's bedroom window reflected only sky now, the glass flashing blank and bright as a mirror turned to the wall. The drawer beneath the sill yielded one last secret, a theatre program from the 1917 Louisville Opera House, its margins filled with doodled hearts and the repeated initials DF plus JG keys in alternating colors like a child's valentine. As afternoon shadows stretched across the lawn, I wandered through the gardens where petals lay trampled into the paths. The famous rose bushes stood denuded, their thorns clutching at empty air. Only the greenhouse remained untouched, its glass panes fogged with condensation, the air inside thick with the scent of orchids left to rot in their pots. On the gardener's workbench, a clipboard held meticulous notes. White Phalaenopsis for main hall, Mrs. B's favourite. Water tews fry with 1,4 TSP Epsom salts. The page was dated the morning before Daisy's last visit. Dusk found me in Gatsby's closet, where the last traces of his cologne lingered beneath the hangers that had once held his rainbow of shirts. The cedar shelves bore the indents of his shoe trees, the precise spacing revealing his fastidious nature. In the corner, a crumpled handkerchief held the ghostly imprint of lipstick, not Daisy's perfect rose, but the garish orange red of a party girl who'd gotten too close one wild night. I took only 3 things when I left: the Opera House program, the chalkboard menu, and one perfect white orchid that had somehow survived the neglect. The flower trembled in my hand as I walked through the marble foyer for the last time, its petals already browning at the edges like the newspaper clippings Gatsby had hoarded. At the threshold, I turned for a final look. The setting sun painted the empty ballroom gold, its rays sliding across the scarred floor where champagne spills had warped the wood. Somewhere in the walls, the pipes groaned as the water was shut off for good. A shutter banged upstairs where the tower window had been left open, the sound echoing through the hollow rooms like the ghost of applause after the last guest has gone. The taxi to the station smelled of cigarettes and old leather. As we drove past the gates, I caught one last glimpse of the mansion through the ironwork, its windows dark, its turrets silhouetted against the violet sky, the whole colossal affair already fading into the realm of legend. Somewhere beyond it, across the darkening water, the green light winked on for the evening, illuminating nothing but an empty dock. That night at the hotel, I dreamed of Gatsby standing on his sun-dappled lawn, surrounded by faceless guests who laughed without sound. He wore his cream suit and held a glass of champagne that never emptied, his smile fixed and bright as a paper moon. When I called to him, he turned with arms outstretched, but the crowd kept moving between us, their swirling dresses and dark suits forming an impenetrable wall. By the time I pushed through, only his drink remained, balanced precariously on the diving board as the pool water rippled beneath it, though no one had touched the surface. I woke with a start to find the orchid on my nightstand had shed its petals overnight. They lay in a perfect circle around the vase, like the remains of some tiny, private wake. Through the open window, the first train of the day whistled its departure, a long, mournful note that seemed to echo across all the empty places where dreams go to die. The tide goes out. The train wheels sang a different rhythm west of Chicago, their metallic heartbeats slowing as the plains stretched wide. Through the grimy window, I watched telephone poles mark time like a conductor counting rests between movements, their wires dipping and rising in endless waves. My reflection ghosted across the glass, a man growing leaner, quieter, his eastern edges slowly being worn smooth by the miles. The rented room in Minneapolis smelled of pine soap and old newspapers. At night, the radiator hissed like a disapproving librarian as I spread Gatsby's relics across the quilt. The chalkboard menu with its careful notation about strawberries, the opera program with its youthful doodles, the single cufflink that had escaped the packing crate. Moonlight through the thin curtains turned them into museum pieces, artifacts from a civilization swallowed by time. Winter came howling down from Canada, scouring the streets with snow that fell straight and true, unlike the swirling Long Island flakes that had always seemed to dance for an audience. I took a small accounting job where the numbers behaved, adding up to sums that made honest sense. At lunch, I watched shop girls share sandwiches on park benches, their breath making quick clouds in the air as they laughed about things that would never matter. News from the East arrived like leaves blown across continents. A postcard from Jordan showing a Palm Beach golf course, her scrawled, "You'd hate it here." The only message. A newspaper clipping about Tom and Daisy wintering in Cannes, their faces blurred in a crowd of other beautiful strangers. Once, a business circular noting the demolition of a certain West Egg eyesore to make way for modern apartments. Spring thaw brought floods that turned the Mississippi into a churning beast. From the safe height of the Stone Arch Bridge, I watched the brown water carry whole trees downstream, their branches reaching like desperate arms. A workman next to me spat into the current. "She takes what she wants," he said. And it was true. The river had no favorites, no sentimental attachments, only the relentless pull towards some greater body it would never truly reach. Summer nights found me on the screened porch of a borrowed lake cabin, listening to the loons call across black water. Their cries sounded like the last pure notes of a jazz song played too late at night. Sometimes, when the moon was full, I'd take Gatsby's ledger down to the dock and run my fingers over his boyish handwriting. Study electricity, practice elocution, be better. The pages smelled faintly of hay and kerosene, the scent of a farmhouse where a boy once lay awake dreaming of cities that sparkled. One August evening, a storm rolled in from the west. As lightning pulsed behind the clouds, I watched children play tag along the shore, their bare feet kicking up sprays of water that caught the last light. A particularly bold girl climbed onto the old wooden raft and struck a pose, her arms outstretched toward the darkening horizon. "Who are you reaching for?" I called. She grinned, her braids swinging. "Tomorrow!" Then she cannonballed into the water, scattering minnows and her own reflection. The first raindrop sent everyone running for cover. Back in the cabin, as thunder shook the windows, I opened the ledger to its final page. There, beneath Jimmy Gats's meticulous schedules, J. Gatsby had scrawled in hurried script, "Can't repeat the past? Why, of course you can." The ink had bled slightly, as if written in haste or with uncharacteristically trembling hands. A moth battered itself against the kerosene lamp, drawn to a light that would leave its wings dustless. Outside, the rain fell straight down now, erasing the lake's surface one drop at a time. I closed the ledger gently, smoothing my hand over its cracked leather cover, worn at the corners from years of being carried against a hopeful heart. Years turn, as years do. My hair silvered at the temples. The ledger's spine cracked further. Cities rose and fell in the newspapers. And always, when summer nights grew heavy with humidity, I'd catch the faintest whiff of salt air, or gardenias, or expensive cologne, and for one suspended moment I'd be standing again on Gatsby's terrace, watching him reach toward that damned green light. Last autumn, on a trip to the Oregon coast, I found myself walking a beach at twilight. The tide was going out, leaving behind perfect mirrors in the wet sand that reflected the first stars until the next wave came to erase them. It struck me then how Gatsby had been like those tidal pools, brilliant but temporary, reflecting borrowed light until the inevitable return to the greater dark. From my pocket I took the last surviving orchid petal, now translucent as old parchment. The wind snatched it before my fingers could open fully, carrying it out over the water where it dipped and rose like the world's smallest sailboat, disappearing into the horizon where sea and sky blurred together. Somewhere behind me a bonfire crackled to life, its sparks swirling upward to join the stars. Laughter rang across the sand, real and unself-conscious, the kind that needs no champagne or orchestras or carefully staged gardens. I turned my back to the sea and walked toward that warm light, leaving the tide to do what tides have always done. The waves kept whispering, of course, they always do. But now their secrets belonged to someone else, standing on his dock, arms outstretched toward that distant green light, forever reaching, forever hoping. His story reminds us that dreams can be both beautiful and fragile, like candle flames dancing in the dark. But tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember this. Not all lights must guide us forward. Some exist simply to remind us of the stars we once wished upon, and the quiet magic of letting go. Sweet dreams. Good night.